Dalzell Estate was part of a royal hunting forest belonging to the Dalzell Earls of Carnwath until it was sold to James Hamilton in 1647. At one time it stretched from the banks of the Clyde to Corsington and to Lord Belhaven's estate at Craigneuk, covering the area now known as Motherwell. At the centre of it all was Dalzell House, the oldest part surviving from the 16th century. The keep still forms the heart of the mansion. James Hamilton made additions in 1649, and 100 years later the estate grounds were first landscaped by Archibald Hamilton. In 1857, John Hamilton further developed the house into the form much as we see it today. The long connection of the Hamiltons with Dalzell ended with the death of Lord Gavin Hamilton in 1952. After serving as a boys' school for a time, the house was renovated for use as private flats in 1986. Nobody's certain where the name Dalzell comes from. It's possibly taken from the Gaelic, meaning white meadow, after a type of daisy once found down by the Clyde. The heraldic bearings of the Dalzell Hamiltons sport a Latin tag with the meaning "Who dares go forward?" It appears that the Dalzell family held the barony for 500 years, from the reign of Kenneth until Sir Robert lost it in 1342, when it was taken from him by David II for having the audacity to reside in England without the king's permission. The first Dalzell to appear on record was Hugo of Dalzell, Sheriff of Lanark in the days of William Wallace. Thomas of Dalzell paid homage to Edward I in 1298, 2 years after the beginning of English rule. Thomas is known to have changed sides to fight alongside Bruce at Bannockburn. In any event, the barony was restored in 1395. The Motherwell lands then passed through many hands, but always to members of the Dalzell family. In the early days, there was probably a timber construction on the site. The Whinny or Dalzell Burn flows through a steep and rocky gorge along the east and south side of the building. Pont's map of 1549 shows a house surrounded by a stockade. Across the burn there was a hall belonging to the Nisbets, who were the joint owners of the barony at the time. The keep, with its 8-foot thick walls and narrow slits for windows, was well protected by the gorge, and probably was enclosed by a courtyard wall and a dry moat. The structure had a vaulted basement with a vaulted hall above, which was divided into 2 stories by a timbered floor. Above this was another story with walls and galleries, and on the level of the battlements was a garret or room in the roof. Originally, entry would have been 12 feet off the ground at first floor level by way of a detachable wooden ladder in the interests of security. Behind the courtyard wall would probably have been a saddler, blacksmith and a mason, and an outside kitchen, but the keep can't have been a particularly comfortable place to live in. These were the days before agricultural improvement, and most of the estate would have been sterile and naked, according to the Reverend Robert Clayson, writing in 1792. The second Earl of Carnwath had been given the lands of Dalzell by his father, and in 1635 obtained a charter from Charles I transferring them into the barony of Dalzell, including the half that belonged to the Nisbet family. In 1647 the lands were bought by his cousin James Hamilton of Boggs. He was second son to the 5th Laird of Orbiston and became the first of the Hamiltons of Dalzell. The Hamiltons of Orbiston could trace their lineage almost as far back as the Dalzells, their ancestors also being the Dukes of Hamilton and Abercorn. James became wealthy by supplying the army with meal and provisions during the Cromwell Wars. He used his fortune to good effect, setting to work repairing the keep, and in only 2 years had added a new baronial house to the south and other buildings to the north. These alterations are commemorated by a plaque on the keep wall. This contemporary sketch shows that the keep seems to have lost its garret at this time. The buildings on the south side included a vaulted kitchen and a round tower at the southwest corner. Upper floors contain bedrooms. A new ground level entrance was formed between the keep and the new extension, subsequently blocked off by later alterations. A wheel stair projected into the courtyard from the first floor and rises the full height of the wing. At right angles to the south wall, a curtain wall ran parallel to the keep and joined with the smaller extensions to the north, thereby creating a courtyard. The present 2 entrances in this wall were originally smaller doorways. James, his wife and children now had a state-of-the-art, comfortable dwelling to live in. Archibald Hamilton was the 4th Laird of Dalzell, and he was the first to lay out the estate grounds. This leading agricultural improver enclosed fields with hedges and sheltered them with tree planting. Archibald encouraged tenant farming and gave out feus and leases on the estate, initially at Windmill Hill and South Motherwell. The population of the parish around the time of his death in 1774 was still only around some 500 people. Now, every self-respecting house of any antiquity should have at least one ghost. Dalzell has 3. The first recorded apparition, the Green Lady, is said to haunt the old entrance to the keep, her presence being detected by an oriental perfume. These were interesting times in Lanarkshire. Robert Owen of New Lanark fame intended to lease 600 acres from the Hamiltons at Orbiston near Motherwell to establish a new community. The venture was never begun as Owen moved to America. However, Archibald James Hamilton kept alive the idea of introducing a new social order to the world, and in 1825, together with Edinburgh man Abraham Coombe, formed a communal settlement at Orbiston and invested considerable sums of money there. The site was near what is now the first green of Dalzell Golf Course. The buildings were to be massive 4-storey structures built to accommodate 1,200 people and were to be even grander than those at New Lanark. Weavers were manufacturing cotton for shirts, bookbinders and printers were employed, and the foundry and horticultural departments were beginning to provide goods to the Glasgow markets. However, only about a quarter of the buildings were ever finished, and the scheme folded within a couple of years due to financial difficulties and the ill health of the co-founders. The buildings were demolished immediately afterwards. Orbiston was the first experiment in communal living in Britain, but all that remains are these columns set up as a tribute by Hamilton architect Alexander Cullen in 1910. John Glencairn Carter Hamilton succeeded as Laird of Dalzell in 1834. His interest was politics. He was a keen Liberal and supporter of Gladstone. In recognition of his service to the public, he was made the first Baron and first Lord Hamilton of Dalzell by Queen Victoria in 1886. And dramatic changes were on the way in the district. The completion of the Motherwell to Coatbridge Railway in 1841 allowed for the easy transfer of hard splint coal to the new ironworks in the Monklands. By the mid-1800s, coal and iron ore were being mined in earnest. The first ironworks was opened in Motherwell in 1871, and David Colville opened his Dalzell Ironworks the following year. In 100 years, Motherwell had expanded from several small villages into a town of over 10,000 people. By the end of the century, mines were operating close to the house at Camp, and only a few hundred yards from the North Lodge entrance, the Wishaw Coal Company operated the Dalzell and Broomside pit from 1869 right up until 1948. It was during the turbulent times of the mid-19th century that John Hamilton decided that it was time to modernise the house again. He used architect and historian Robert William Billings, an associate of William Byrne and David Bryce. The revival of the 17th century baronial style was all the rage in Scotland at the time. Further up the Clyde, Sir Walter Scott had chosen Byrne as architect for Milton Lockhart, and Bryce had created the baronial frontages to Robert Adams' Maulesley Castle. Between 1854 and 1858, Billings devoted his life to Dalzell. We're very grateful for getting access to some of the private flats for this section. A new entrance to the keep was cut in the west wall, and the basement floor was excavated, creating an entrance hall from what had been a low-ceilinged room. Above the entrance, he designed a fine dining room with a baronial fireplace. He took out the intermediate floor and used the corbels as trusses for ribs to support the roof. A piper's gallery was placed high above on the opposite wall from the fireplace. The lower part of the walls were lined with wood panelling, and carved panels depict the story of the prodigal son. Dating from 1613, they were brought to the house from England and the continent by John Hamilton during the Victorian period. The library was hung with many portraits and clothed with elegant furnishings. Much was removed for safekeeping in the 1970s. The books, part of the Hamilton of Dalzell collection, are now in Motherwell Heritage Centre. Billings' fireplace surround and the original fireplace are still there, however, albeit now separate from each other. Other alterations included a wing out from the south wall to overlook the new terrace gardens. A drawing room with a fine oriel window was created on the first floor of the wing. 4 carved pilasters support a superb stuccoed ceiling, depicting the ancestral emblems and heraldic history of the Hamiltons of Dalzell. Billings apparently carried out much of the ceiling and the ornamental carving and mouldings of the interior himself. He designed a completely new northern wing in sympathy with the older structure. Stables and servants' quarters were also built here, and they were converted to houses in the 1980s. A royal visit to the house by the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1888 was commemorated by the inscription of the Prince of Wales' feathers above the courtyard entrance. And in the courtyard, Billings beautifully modernised the 60-foot deep St Margaret's Well. John Hamilton had his own personal coat of arms inscribed high on the gable, and it appears that the room in the roof of the keep had been reinstated by him some years earlier. Baron Nisbet's stone was moved to the front of the house from the Easter Brace site of the Nisbets' Hall. This was a symbol of the Baron's power of life and death over his tenants. Things didn't go without incident. Only 10 years after the conversion was completed, 2 upper stories were destroyed by fire. But the damage to the rest of the house was limited by the thick walls of the keep. A very thankful Lord Hamilton had this plaque erected on the southwest wall. The second of the ghosts associated with the house came from these times. She was known as the White Lady, apparently a serving girl who, finding herself pregnant and abandoned by her lover, flung herself off the battlements into the Whinny Burn. The terrace gardens were laid out in the 1860s by a local gardener, Andrew Castles, as a present from John Hamilton to his wife Lady Eleanor Leslie Melville. They are now owned and maintained by the occupiers of the flats. The parterre still supports low-clipped box hedging set in geometric patterns reintroduced in the 1980s. The garden continued the revival of interest in the Renaissance style, first seen locally at the Hanging Gardens of Barnclouth, across the Clyde at Hamilton. Billings designed the decorative stonework of the terraces at Dalzell. The ornate gate posts on the west side came from stone salvaged from the conversion. The retaining wall, based on a design from Edzell Castle in Angus, has plaques with Lord and Lady Hamilton's initials and the date 1863 carved on them. On the outside of the garden wall is a medieval coffin lid, found under the keep when the floor was being lowered for the new doorway in Billings' time. It bears the emblem of the Hamiltons of Dalzell. Set into the garden wall is a monogram plaque of Lord Hamilton and Lady Eleanor, indicating the date of the fire, 1868, and restoration, 1869. A stone known as the Koran stone is embedded into another wall. Now very worn, the inscription on the stone is very fitting. Said to date from the 1700s, it was originally set into a wall across the burn. There's still a fountain in the garden, with goldfish in the pond, and a sundial. On the east side of the garden there's a fine view down to the waterfall on the Whinny Burn. So thanks to John Hamilton and Billings, Dalzell at last became a stately home. Royal visits were frequent, as were hunting and shooting parties. Queen Victoria's children were known to prefer Dalzell to the much grander Hamilton Palace, and the present Queen visited Dalzell before her coronation. Whilst this is not the end of the story of the house, it's a good time to take a look round the 50 acres of the estate that remains, now a country park maintained by North Lanarkshire Council. And a major effort is now being made to refurbish the estate, thanks mainly to the Heritage Lottery Fund. Jerry Lewis is in charge of the project.
And this is a historic landscape survey and restoration management plan which was done for us by the Ash Consulting Group. We decided the high point was probably the sort of end of the 19th century and start of the 20th century. The estate was at the kind of size that it is now. It was at its prime. It was when a lot of the plantings were starting to come in to their maturity. And what came out through the consultation was that people were keen to see the area restored, but not really changed in any way.
In parallel with the development of the house, the immediate estate was laid out in a manner appropriate to the style of the day. First formal, then romantic, with meadows, rustic features in the glens, informal clumps of trees. By far the oldest tree is the Covenanter's oak. This was planted over 800 years ago and is of a similar genus to the Cadzow oaks at the Duke of Hamilton's High Parks over the Clyde at Hamilton. Tradition has it that in the 17th century the Reverend Lauder preached to some 400 Covenanters here in comparative safety, as the Hamiltons were sympathetic to the Covenanters' cause. General Roy's map from 1747 and this map, published by Forrest in 1816, shows that the estate would have had a much more formal layout than that of today, with geometric shapes and grids with avenues of trees. Across the river from the house, in 1765, Archibald Hamilton built a semicircular grotto, possibly to amplify the sound of the waterfall. This was where the Koran stone was originally located. In 1822, the kitchen gardens were removed to a site nearer the Clyde, and an arboretum with rare and non-native species, now only reaching maturity, was planted.
This is one of the huge sequoia or giant redwoods that's in the arboretum part of the park. There was a big interest in these days. It was nice to have a collection of trees that you could show to your guests, and it's quite an unselfish thing to do, to plant a tree, in that we 150 years later are seeing the benefit of someone else's work.
A Japanese garden was planted in the 1920s by Lady Sybil in a natural hollow surrounded by trees. Steps once led up to a yellow and green painted wooden temple.
This is the Japanese garden. This one has deteriorated over the age. The plan here is actually trying to bring it back to its sort of formal design. For this, it's one of two gardens that we're going to create in the sort of later stage. We're also going to try and create a new garden down by the mausoleum in Lord Gavin's Temple. It's the Sow Bridge. When the engineers looked at it, they found it was probably actually perhaps 3 bridges that had been built gradually over the years. With the traffic using it, it started to bow out a little bit, and at one point we thought we were going to have to do a lot of work with it. Thankfully now it looks like we're not going to have to do that, and we're going to try and restore the bridge. It's quite a gentle restoration of it now.
Archibald was probably inspired by the classical paintings of Italian landscapes. The wooded glen here impresses with its mix of trees, dotted with some classical structures.
This is the High Arch Bridge, and I expect it once was used as a bridge. People would stroll across, and you can actually find the remains of a path that went through there. However, health and safety issues today, there's just no way we could let people walk over a bridge like that now. It's such a drop, and it's got no parapet. This is the yew house, and it's a circle of yew trees, and originally I think had a central yew trunk going up, and then had a wooden roof somewhere up in the canopy, and it was a sheltered place where people could come down from the house and look out at the view down into the glen.
Below the valley opens out, and a well dedicated to St Patrick, and probably of 12th century origin, still gurgles away. The wellhead was rebuilt in the 18th century. This was the site of the original Japanese garden and became a Dutch garden for a time. It's overlooked by Lord Gavin's temple. The pillars originally stood at the entrance to the Orbiston buildings and were brought here in the 1920s by Lord Gavin to create a viewpoint to overlook his wife's grave down at the mausoleum. The Hamilton Mausoleum was built in 1840 by Gavin's father next to the old parish cemetery. The General and other family members are buried here. However, Lord Gavin and his wife Sybil are buried in the walled enclosure just outside the mausoleum. A church had been built in the 13th century in what is now the old graveyard. It stood here for 500 years, was rebuilt in 1718 and then demolished in 1789 when South Dalzell Parish Church was built up in Motherwell. The early 20th century saw the population of Motherwell topping the 40,000 mark, and John Hamilton, whilst keen to ensure public access to the churchyard on the Clyde, had a new road known as the White Walk constructed, so retaining an element of privacy to the house and its immediate surroundings. During the slump following the Napoleonic Wars, Archibald James provided work for the unemployed, rerouting the Burn after some serious flooding and creating embankments to protect the low-lying ground by the Clyde. The embankments were last substantially reinforced with spoil from the Broomside Colliery in the 1920s. There used to be a boathouse here for a rowing boat to connect with the only part of the estate across the Clyde at Cunningar. And this is where a little building known as Gladstone's Cottage was, so called because the great man had taken tea there on a visit in 1879. The building was latterly moved up to Dalzell House, but unfortunately it was destroyed by fire in the 1980s. The Easterbraes grazing lands, the site of the Nisbets' Tower House or Hall, are on the north of the Chestnut Walk, a row of trees which are the remains of an earlier plantation. By the 1830s, beech, oak, elm and yew were all well established at Dalzell. Now, pavilions at spectacular viewpoints were popular with the landowners in these times. In the 1730s, Archibald built a garden temple overlooking the spot where the Clyde cuts through a rocky gorge. This was in the Adams style and still survives today, much altered and extended as a private house. No doubt the effect was less tranquil after the Caledonian Railway built a viaduct across the Clyde at the same spot in the 1850s to tap the vast coal reserves in the Hamilton-Colburn area. Below was one of the main drives to Dalzell House. This was known for a time as the Prince's Drive after the visit by the Prince of Wales in 1888. The South Lodge to Dalzell House had been built near the old Clyde Bridge on the Motherwell-Hamilton Road about 10 years earlier. It shows some of the characteristics of the Billings style. Lord Gavin George Hamilton was the last of the Hamiltons of Dalzell to stay at Dalzell House. During the First World War, the north wing of the house was used as a hospital, and it soon became full of convalescing soldiers. The third ghost, the Grey Lady, dutifully haunts this wing, her grey appearance apparently being the colour of a nurse's uniform at this time. Just before the Second World War, about 20 workers were employed on the estate and about 15 in the house. Jessie MacLeod worked there in 1933.
Can you remember when you started working for Lord Gavin Hamilton at Dalzell House?
July 1933.
July 1933? Good.
Yes.
When did you finish working there?
7 years after it. I married in 1944.
Oh.
And I used to go up to the house to help them out now and then. I was really in service all my time since I was 14. And I had an interview with the housekeeper, and then I decided I would accept the job. There was 2 housemates, and I was the head houseman. In fact, all the staff were very nice.
Good.
Very, very fortunate to have nice people.
Did you come in contact with Lord Hamilton very much? That's Gavin Hamilton as his name was.
Oh yes, quite frequently we used to meet him.
How did you find him as an employer?
Oh, very, very nice.
Was he?
Very much a gentleman. He went abroad, you see, when his health, to Africa for the winter months.
I believe he used to take the butler with him for 3 months at a time.
Yes, yes.
It was quite a good job he had, wasn't it?
Oh, he had a very good job. Very, and he knew it. And he knew it too. I must say, I was very happy in my situation.
On Lord Gavin's death in 1952, the title fell to his nephew John de Heenan Hamilton. It was decided that the family could no longer stay at Dalzell. The estate was taken over by the then borough of Motherwell and Wishaw, and the house was subsequently sold to be used as a boarding school for boys, known as Gresham House.
It was basically a boarding school, probably about 80-85% boarding and about 15% day boy. But you're talking about 44 years ago.
Yeah, there were about between 60 and 80 boys in the school.
It's all good fun. There's all sort of cricket and rugby and plenty of swimming and plenty of running about, plenty of open space. Now that was the headmaster's access from one side of the school to the other, neither of which Gavin and I were ever allowed into, or any of the other pupils for that matter. Yeah. And that side were predominantly the senior classes, S1 and S2.
This was the juniors up here.
And the juniors, as Gavin said, were on J2, J1 and remove, which was what we say nowadays is trans. Kitchen was in there, on the left hand side going along Gavin, and the dining room on the right hand side.
Yeah, that's right.
And the food was terrible. On a very cold morning, if you made your way along the corridor between the dining room and the kitchens and wheeled left into the kitchen, there was an enormous flagstone area and a range at the far side of the room. Huge. A great big pot, enormous pot of porridge which had been prepared the night before and presumably had gone hard on the skin, and there was a cat sleeping on it most mornings just to keep warm. So And that's true, that's a true story.
When you used to go down into the gym, you went in there clean and came out filthy.
It was I always thought of the place as a sort of male St Trinian's.
Very much.
Insofar as it was all very much cap, uniform and whites for cricket and all this good stuff.
If it was filthy or muddy, you got hosed down with a 2-inch hose before you were allowed into the bath. The bath.
So there's probably a Lanarkshire Gordonson without the academic achievements. Pobble was a prefect, and he had a habit of sleepwalking along the corridors at night, and he used to sort of wail as he went along, and quite often was mistaken for the Green Lady. It caused sheer and utter havoc and chaos in the school. Actually, Gresham House was an excellent name for the school, because you could impress people nowadays when you say which school. You say Gresham House, they have no idea whether you're talking about a branch of Eton or.
I'll say one thing about the place. It made you very much. You could speak to other people. That's one thing he taught you. He didn't teach you much to do with school things and things like that.
No, I think it taught you to be more outgoing than the average person. You suddenly became much more international. As I said earlier on, having met people from South Africa, Rhodesia, the Far East, and America and whatnot, who came here to board, you had a much wider scope when you left school than the average.
I must say we've never seen one of them since.
I've seen a few of them since. And some of them did quite well. Some of them did quite well. Some local millionaires did quite well.
The school closed in 1969 and the house lay empty for several years, deteriorating and becoming an increasing burden on the local council.
Well, Classical House were originally sucked into this following the publicity that DL House got. I believe at a committee meeting of the then Motherwell District Council, a couple of councillors had said that, look, unless they can find a solution for DL House within a meaningful timescale, that it was destined for the bulldozer. There was no alternative use for it found after the school closed, and for many years it remained vacant and abandoned, and it fell heir to the council, who made a number of valiant attempts to try and secure the property and come up with a new use. But you've got to bear in mind, at that time, this is 20 odd years ago, it wasn't as fashionable as it is perhaps nowadays to refurbish and convert and restore buildings of that type. After making a submission to Motherwell District Council, Classical House was chosen as the preferred developer to convert the Ale House into residential accommodation. We acquired the building from the council for £1, which sounds like a bargain when you look at it nowadays, but bear in mind the sums didn't work. I think the works for DL probably took about 15 months. And then at the end of the day, you sell the property, and the income from that, along with the grants, goes to make the formula, to make the cocktail work. And it was a pleasurable job for us. It was a joy to get up and go and work on DL in the morning. It's such a magnificent confection, and it had so many idiosyncrasies within the building that it was just a pleasure to work on.
We did not want any new build within the grounds. So DL House was restored back to its former glory without the need to damage the environments or the estate by putting in new build housing, which at the time a lot of developers were prepared to do work to DL House, but they also wanted to do new build, and that was, I think, a saving grace, and I think it presents a very, very pleasing picture today that the estate is left as an oasis in what was an industrial part of Motherwell, with the house as an important feature of the estate.
The building was in atrocious condition. Bear in mind that vandals had almost had free run of the property for 4 or 5 years. It was absolutely riddled with dry rot. It had a number of fires in it. A number of the fireplaces had actually been stolen. By the time we had stripped out the rotten areas of timber, the areas with structural problems, the areas of the roof that were in various stages of collapse, you could stand on the ground floor of the building in various areas and look up to the sky. Now, you wouldn't believe that to look at the building now, but that was the extent of the problem that existed there. We found, as we were going through the building, repairs. Where we were in doing dry rot repairs, you would lift a floorboard or a piece of panelling or skirting and you would find a name in pencil. James McGlinchey, joiner to Lord Hamilton, dry rot repairs, 1873.
The original leadwork dated back from the original 19th century when it was first installed. That was all redone. Slate work. All the external walls required to be completely repointed. Windows mostly were all renewed, but they had to be renewed as per the existing style, which was sash and case windows. Any stonework which required to be renewed was renewed in stonework using stonemasons and bringing in expert workmen to do that. It was a formidable task, and the whole project took over a year from beginning to end. We've now created 18 very desirable apartments, all unique. There's not one identical to the other.
Our selling agents at that time were O'Neill's, and the partner who was responsible for the sales spent a lot of time in the building, obviously a lot of time on his own, waiting for people to turn up. He had 2 magnificent Labradors, but there was one particular flat down in the oldest part of the building. He could not get his dogs to go into that particular flat. Albeit there are a lot of stories about pink ladies, grey ladies, etc., etc. To be honest, we didn't experience anything directly ourselves.
The project started in 1986. It's now 2006, and these sort of projects go on forever, and residents continue to maintain, improve and fine-tune, and that's part of our building on a project such as this. But part of the pleasure of seeing an old building which is on its knees, dead, and then it's brought back to life. And I always think the windows are the eyes of a building, and when that comes back you start to really see the benefit, and all the money and all the effort is very, very well spent.
So the outlook for one of the very last of the big houses to survive in the Middle Clyde Valley and its designed landscape, with terraced gardens, picturesque waterfall, mausoleum and old graveyard, extensive parkland and woodland, and Japanese garden, seems assured for future generations to live in, pass through and enjoy.